All right, back again today. So I did a little bit of work off camera since last stream. And there goes my phone. Great, we're already off to a scuff start. All right, so this was the first attempt at making the monitor that I did a worrying long time ago. If I want to get this art study done in any time soon, which I thought was too high-tech, too modern, although I did like this. This is what I tried to make last time, so trying to go back to a more retro look for the monitor, but unfortunately what I wound up doing was I realized that I had actually skipped a lot of the steps from the tutorial on making these textures, and instead of starting out with the outlines and the shading, I was already starting with a lot of what I had here as a base, and it started to turn pretty muddy. It's not really well defined what the shape of the bezel is. From a distance, the top kind of looks right, but as you start following the bezel down, it's almost like the bezel is twisting and becoming flat instead of, you know, an actual indent into this panel. So I really wasn't happy with the way that turned out. So I took a step back after the stream and I made this instead. So as you can see, there's no texture on this one. I haven't tried to add in the glow. It's not really done, but there's a few different things that I've done here. One, I realized that the shading was backwards on some of the parts of the screen, and that's just up to... I'm not traditionally an artist, and what I think the shading would be and what it actually would be in that scenario are two very different things. So I actually got a flashlight and was just pointing it at a bunch of different cutouts of metal and things to see what it would look like, and also just looking over the references I have for CRT monitors. And one of the big things I realized, well, I think there was two things I realized that I was doing wrong. One is there's actually two gradients here. Oh, that's the other thing. I switched to using gradients. I broke down and started using them, and they definitely helped. So you can see there's this outer gradient along the outside that starts off light and it gets darker towards the bottom. And that's the same as what I was doing here. But then there's another gradient that's backwards. So this one starts off here and it gets darker as it goes toward the top. And that's not really what I was doing here. If you look here, it's almost like a solid color all the way around, which I think is part of the reason why it's a little bit ill-defined. So it occurred to me, and looking at the reference material, that this edge would be dark because it's not in the light, but this edge down here would have more light catching it. So then after that is the actual the part of the bezel that actually goes into the monitor, and this is the biggest change by far. For one, I decided to try manually shading this, and it's not great. You can see the stepping of what I was doing. I literally just took two grays that are almost completely transparent, and with the brush just started manually layering the gradient in, and then used the blur tool to try and soften it a bit. I've actually got two different here. I wasn't quite sure what would look better. So on this side, I have a steeper angle for the gradient, and on that side, it's a lot shallower. But that made a huge difference. So I've got the top dark up here, and then as you get towards the bottom, it gets much lighter. And then I added these highlights at the very edges that you can see in both of the reference images. You can see the corners are highlighted. So I tried to replicate that as well, and that I think made a huge difference. This looks like it has depth. I still don't think that this really looks quite right. I think part of it is because of how thin it is, and the other part I think has to do with the color. And this kind of gets into something I'll talk about in a minute, that why I think I'm starting to understand the Ben Mathis site and why they don't start with the grayscale image. I think I'm starting to see the reason for that. But sticking with this, I also made some other changes to the panel itself. So I decided to model this as if this whole thing was just one plate that's bolted on to whatever it is. So I gave some depth around the edges. I'm not quite sure I'm happy with how that looks. It almost makes it look like there's some sort of chamfer around the edge, which isn't really what I intended, but I think it definitely looks like it has depth now, and it wasn't that hard to make this. It wasn't that hard at all. Now, a couple of things I said that I realized I was doing wrong before. One was the range of the color. So you can see it starts off very light up here and it gets very dark down here. I realized that I was using way too wide of a range on the color. So you can see this gradient, while it's light, it's not as light compared to this one. The gray is the same color in the background, but this isn't quite as light, and this is nowhere near as dark at the bottom. So I've realized that I was just going to way too far on the extremes for the shading. Same thing here. You can see this color and this color are nowhere near as different as they were. So that made a huge difference, realizing just how I needed to be a lot more subtle with the color changes. So that was one of the biggest things I realized I was doing wrong. And also, let me go ahead and I copied the screen over. This isn't really final, but the screen doesn't quite look right now. I think it's probably the shading in the corners isn't exactly right for this new shape, but I definitely think it's getting closer to what I was envisioning. Now, there's some stuff I'm still not happy with. The buttons over here, not great. They don't really look like buttons. This was supposed to be a vent. It doesn't really look like a vent, and this was supposed to be a cutout for an LED, which I think might work, but I need to add the glow of the LED. But at least this part I'm a lot happier with. Now, that kind of leads me to the Ben Mathis tutorial. And one of the problems I was having is when I look at this doesn't look right. I keep having to remind myself, this is not the final color. This is supposed to be the shading, like the luminosity of the final color. This whole inner part is supposed to be black. Every part of it, including this. It's just this inner part is shaded darker because it's in shadow, but it's all still supposed to be black. And I keep trying to remind myself of that, but it's very difficult for me to draw the lighting when I'm not seeing what the color is supposed to be. I keep getting tempted to make this darker, but if I make this darker, then it looks like it's being inset into the panel again. And I keep having to remind myself that that's not, that this is just the light is what I'm painting right now. So if I bring up the Ben Mathis tutorial, let me bring up this up. So this tutorial has, you can see they actually start with the color. They don't start with the shading, or with the black and white, or the medium gray that the really popular tutorial on YouTube has. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but this is a very different way of going about it. Let me see if I can find in here where they talk about it. It may not have been in here. The might have been on this first one talking about it, but yeah, somewhere in here they talked about why they don't start with the medium gray. And if I recall correctly, the reason they said that is that different colors are perceived as different brightnesses. So whenever you start with medium gray and then you try to add the color to it later, it's not quite right. That was the gist of what I had got when I read this the first time. Now, that I may be paraphrasing here because I can't find it in real time, but that I think is the problem I'm running into at the moment, is I'm not thinking about this the right way. I can't find the words. I think that's the problem, is that I'm looking at it in the wrong perspective. I keep trying to think of this. I'm not thinking about the color. So one thing, just try real quick. If I just grab all of this, and we'll just make a new layer real fast. Oop, that does not work. Let me turn down the tolerance a lot. Yeah, so this is also one of the problems with this now. I really should have. The one mistake I did do with this one is I didn't put stuff on different layers like I probably should have. You know what, we'll just do this, and we'll do a new layer, and we will just fill this with solid black. And we'll actually move this up one, and then we will come in here and we'll just delete the edges out real quick. All right, and delete those. And then the last thing I'll do is just delete out the middle. There we go. Okay. So now on this layer, I'm going to bring it back up to 100%. And we're going to set this to something like multiply. And now you can kind of see more what it would look like. You know, and I think that's probably fairly close. Let me try overlay instead. See if that's somewhere in here. I think would be the right range for this. But you can kind of see that it does. Yeah, that's probably something right there. But yeah, you can already kind of start to see some of the problems I'm running into. So similar to what I had before, the moment I try to apply the color to it, a lot of the shading just falls apart. So the highlights down here are now gone. And there's really not a lot, you know, unless you really change that, they just disappear. So that's kind of where I've been a little bit stuck with this, or where I think I'm running into some problems with it. Now, the tutorial I was following, not the Ben Mathis one, but the other one, did mention that you needed to do another shading pass after you applied the color. So I think that's part of why that's recommended in that. But all of that's to say, I think I do see what the other tutorial was getting at, about you probably do need to start with the color and then apply the shading. And I think that might alleviate some of that problem. Either way, that kind of brings me to the next thing, which is that I don't think I'm going to do this on stream anymore, at least for a bit. I've clearly got a lot more I need to learn about shading, and I need to spend some more time refining that myself. And it's just going to be a lot easier to do that off stream, where I can spend more time on it and really focus on it. So what I want to focus on for the rest of the stream today is actually going back to Godot and looking at other ways of creating this effect with the impossible geometry. So the last time, and I talked about this, there's a problem with using the stencil buffer because it makes the tunnel do some weird stuff with the way the shader works. I'm really not entirely certain why this is happening, because this material isn't semi-transparent. Well, it has the alpha mode enabled, but the texture itself is 100% solid. It's almost like it's ignoring the depth buffer in some places, but it's weird because depending on the angle you look at it and how close you get to it, the behavior changes a lot. Like, it's solid right now. I move over here and now it's not solid. There's some really strange stuff like that going on. So I want to look at some other options, and the other option that comes to mind is using the visibility layers to accomplish something similar. So if we come in here to the cooking minigame, this approach required a lot of changes, so I'm gonna back it out. So we'll go to the tunnel material, we're gonna turn off, and also I guess I can show this too. So if I bring up the tunnel material and I just disable the alpha, you can see it's immediately fixed, but now I get errors about the stencil mode not working. So disable the stencil mode, that's fine again. Okay, so back here at the cooking minigame, I am going to change these trees. I'm going to go into the, you're not going to be able to see this, but I'm just going into the custom import settings, and I am disabling the use external material. Okay, so now you can see these are not being affected by the stencil buffer anymore. Now, one thing I did want to test though, before I remove the pane here that actually makes the stencil buffer work, I'm curious what happens with the draw order. There's one thing it occurred to me, I think the answer is no, but I'm curious if things that are being rendered through the stencil buffer get rendered on top of other things in this scene, even if they're behind them, like if it's ignoring the depth buffer. Because I feel like in testing I saw something weird, and I want to just confirm that. So what I'm going to do is just drop a mesh instance in here, and we'll just make this a box. We're going to move it back here, and I'm actually going to move it behind this tree. There we go. It's completely behind it. So we check now. Yep, it appears behind it. I'm going to give this a new material, and we're going to come in here and we're going to enable the alpha. And see, this is the other thing. This thing now has the alpha enabled, but you can see it's not doing what the tunnel material was doing. So I don't know why the tunnel material was different. Anyway, so we go in here, we do custom, and we say equal to layer 7. And now we double check that. Okay, so it is getting correctly rendered behind the tree. Let me see out of curiosity what happens if it's in it. Yeah, okay, so it does behave normally. I saw something in some initial testing that made me think that maybe they were ignoring the depth buffer if you looked at them through, or ignoring the depth buffer compared to other objects in the scene that weren't using the stencil buffer, but that does not appear to be the case. Okay, well, that's good to know. So, all right, the next thing I wanted to test with this is just messing with the visibility layers. So everything that is visual has these visibility layers, and by default everything is just 1 1 1 1, but you can change those layers, and you can change what layers the camera is going to render, which is very useful. I use that in the POC. I change the visibility layers of things like the player model whenever you're the player, so that the camera isn't clipped inside of the player model. So if we go here to the player and we go to here, so we have, yeah, all of the layers are rendered by default. So if I come into here and I say that certain layers are not going to be rendered by default, I can effectively hide them. Now what would that get me? The real benefit of the visibility layers, as far as I can tell, is if you want to have multiple cameras. That's really where that starts to become more relevant. So for instance, if you want an in-game camera, you know, like in the Half-Life games, or Half-Life 2, where you have the physical cameras in the world, but there's certain geometry that you don't want to be rendered, you can disable it. So for instance, if the player model is physically attached to the player camera, you put the player model on a different visibility layer than the player camera that the player camera won't see, but it can be seen by the in-game security camera, for example. So that's one thing you can do with that. Now, if you just want to toggle something on and off, you can also, of course, just make it visible or invisible. So for creating this impossible geometry, the trick is when you're looking at a map of the game, this map can snake all over the place. So in the POC, the map has twists and turns and goes every which direction. So and there's even a part in one of the maps where it turns, comes around, and then loops back facing this way. So if I wanted to have, say, the cooking minigame at a door that's, you know, if we envision we're in a corridor right now, and this corridor is still here, when that cooking minigame opens, I have to make everything here disappear. But this has already been loaded. You know, if we assume that the map comes this way, over here, and then comes back this way, there might be players or something over here. I can't just hide this necessarily. So that's where I'm running into a little bit of confusion about what I'm gonna do. The stencil buffer made it so that you could just selectively hide anything that you're viewing through that pane of glass. You don't need to update any attributes on these, on the other geometry. It's just if you look at it through that invisible pane, it's gone. But we saw that that has some weird side effects with the alpha blending. I don't know what's wrong with that. It does occur to me that may actually have something more to do with the fact that these are CSGs, and it's possible that maybe CSGs don't behave so nicely with that. But the other option is, per player, I selectively hide and unhide geometry, or use something like a obstruction, I forget what they call it, calling plane or obfuscation, whatever. The basically invisible geometry that just hides this geometry could potentially be used. So if I add, what is that called in here? I believe it's a 3D node. And I believe it is under the visual instance, I think it is. Oh, occluder, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, so an occluder oh, interesting, I've got it disabled. So if we come in here and we do a, say, box occluder, we drag that out there, and then I also need to go into here apparently and enable occlusion culling. Okay, so occlusion culling is on. Occlusion, that is not true. I don't know why you're saying occlusion culling is disabled in project settings. Open the project settings. I just did that. That's interesting. Okay, let me try reloading the project. This could be one of those times where Godot needs to be reloaded to work properly. But yeah, so not really expressing myself very clearly here. The issue with just hiding the geometry is that it's going to get very complicated. I'd have to have like a whole system to detect, is this supposed to be hidden, is it not? So I'd have to track like a visibility tree or something on whether or not a part of the tunnel needs to be hidden, that you've already passed. There we go. Oh, yeah, okay. Reloading it fixed that. Weird. Okay, yeah, it does make it disappear. Interesting. Let's make this bigger. Oh, keep that at 1. We'll do 10, 10. Yeah, okay. So it does completely hide it, but it has to be... Okay, so that does work the way I thought it did. Let me come over here to the cooking minigame, and then we'll see what I can do in terms of messing with that. So that's at 2, 2, 1. And 0.4 and 0.5. All right. So we will add that. Oh, interesting. I can just use a quad too. And then I can bring that back. Okay, that's interesting. So they are... I do see them disappearing. That's not doing exactly what I thought it would do. Let me move that back a little bit. I think what's... Yeah, okay, I think I see what's going on. Let me make that like 10 tall. See, I don't understand why that one's not getting included. Make it wider. I mean, this, I think, definitively is not what the occlusion is meant for at all. So this is definitely a hack. But I'm curious to try it like that and just see what happens now. Okay, so I close that. Yeah, okay. So that... Ignoring the fact that the trees are invisible, because that wasn't the intent, it doesn't make the hallway invisible because I think it's too close to the occluder. Now, what I was interested in and why I thought this might work is because it does have a mask. But see, this also talks about it being baked in, which would be problematic because these would be dynamic objects as well. I wonder, is it possible this is just backwards? No, okay, it behaves the same way. I was gonna say, I didn't think these were sided. Let me bring it back into this. And let's just try that again just to confirm. I don't think this is gonna work. Yeah, no, actually it's making parts of that disappear now. Yeah, didn't think so. That's really, this is meant more for optimization, and this is something I'm gonna have to use in the game. But yeah, that's not gonna do what I want. So where I was getting at with hiding and showing objects was that I could potentially detect that everything behind this door needs to be hidden. So I could take the next tunnel segment, hide it, then show the trees instead, because ultimately it doesn't matter. The tree, you know, whatever is behind the door is behind the door. And if I only... Here's the problem. Let's say that the door is here, and that there's a tunnel that comes out over to here, and then it loops back over to here and there. So the tunnel passes through where the impossible geometry would be. If I have a system, in theory, that can hide the tunnel segments that are over here, that you can't possibly see anyways, or you shouldn't normally be able to see, then okay, the trees are visible. But now what happens if the minigame is active and the player goes down the tunnel, back over to here, this way, and over to here? Now they're going to see these trees just hanging out. That's part of the problem. So it might be that I need a hybrid approach, I'm thinking. I think that having the material for the tunnel use the stencil buffer seems to me that that's going to cause a problem. Oh, but you know what? There's another problem. And in fact, there's a bigger problem. So having the player go through there is less of a concern. The bigger problem is, if this is the start of the map over here, and the tunnel comes over to here, wraps around, and then comes this way, the enemies spawn from the beginning of the tunnel. So you're going to see, even if I hide the tunnel, you're going to see enemies running through here because they're going through that tunnel. You would also see other players if they were in there. So that's not going to work. I can't just hide the tunnel. It really does have to be everything gets hidden behind this door. And that's where the stencil buffer does kind of work, but the problem is that means every single object basically in the entire game has to have the stencil buffer set. If I do what I was doing initially, they would have to be getting rendered in the alpha mode. Which would just, for one, it would be incredibly tedious to have to go through and set every material like that. I could probably do like a custom import script or something to do that for me, but that just does not seem like the right approach at all to making that work. Now, one of the other options is to use a sub viewport and a sampler for a sub viewport. So you can put a camera, and this is where I was getting at, is something you can do with the visibility layers. I can do a sub viewport, and I can add to that a camera, and you can do any kind of camera you want, and I can say that this viewport is 360 by 180 or whatever. You can set whatever resolution you want, and this is where the visibility layers can kind of matter, because when you've got two cameras like this, you can have geometry that's only seen by one of the cameras. So, okay, let's say that we put a camera here, or back here even. Okay. And then we say that this thing only renders, it doesn't render layer 1. We'll just say that. We'll just turn all of these off. Is there a clear all? No, there's not. We'll just say that it only renders stuff on layer 2. So you can see in the preview, it disappeared. Now, if I come over here to these pine trees, and unfortunately, these would have to be edited, but if I come over to them, and I put them on layer 2, and only layer 2, and we'll just do it for 1 for the moment. Now we come over here to the sub viewport, you can see that pine tree is visible. Now I can still see it in the editor, but if I actually load up the game, oh, that's weird. I shouldn't be. Oh no, you know what it is? It's because this camera can see everything. So now if I load it up in game, yeah, you can see that middle tree is now gone completely, because the sub viewport, or the player camera, isn't rendering layer 2, but the sub viewport camera is. Now at the moment it's not doing anything. So what you can do, and we'll just get rid of these other trees for the moment because they're just a distraction. So we'll add in a mesh instance, and we'll do this as a plane, and we'll do 1, rotate that this way, Now we're going to do something different this time. We're not going to do the stencil buffer for this. So we'll do 0.5. And we'll just drag this back. I think, what, 0.4? What I had it at. Yeah, okay. So now neither of these is going to be able to see anything. All they see is that plane. But this plane, importantly, is also on layer 1. So this camera can't see it. But now if I go in here and I apply a custom material, and we do a standard material, and then for the texture, we have other options, including viewport texture. So I can do viewport texture. Oh yeah. One thing though, if you do that, you have to click this local to scene option, because it has to reference a node in the node tree, so that it has to be local to the scene. It wouldn't work otherwise. So we do a viewport texture, and then we tell it which viewport, and we select that sub viewport. It's upside down. And there you go. So now that thing is rendering what this camera sees. So you can see if I move the camera around, it moves that around. Now there's some problems with this and some reasons why this isn't necessarily a great option for this. Well, for one, there's that. I don't know why that's weird. Huh. That's interesting. It's acting like the sub viewport isn't there. Okay, that's a new one. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. I wonder if that has to do maybe with the render priority. Is that on this or is it on the mesh? I think it's on the... Let me see. Let me increase the render priority on that, because I'm kind of curious if that's part of the issue, if it's something else. No? Interesting. I've not actually had that happen before. Normally that works. I'm doing something wrong, but that aside, you can see what the intended effect is here. But the problem, there's two problems with this. When I move the camera, if we imagine that the editor camera is the player camera, it just looks like I'm looking at a painting, because the camera that's rendering it isn't moving. So what you have to do to make the effect convincing is you have to grab this camera and you have to move it around as well. So you basically have to have this thing follow or copy the same transform as the player camera or the main camera, which isn't impossible to do, but it is kind of a pain. I'm really curious why that's not working, because this normally works fine. The other issue is the world 3D. So in the map, I have a world environment. That world environment isn't being rendered by this camera because the sub viewport is like a self-contained instance. So you have to load that. You have to add that in here yourself, which gets to be very annoying very quickly. But this is another option. Now, one thing I could potentially do really quick is I could come in here and add a very quick script. I don't know how much this matters because it's not going to really work anyways, I don't think. But if I reference that, we'll just do this really inefficiently at the moment. And we'll say that this thing dot transform equals the get viewport dot camera 3D dot transform. All right, let's see if that is actually very strange. I'm not clear on why that's not working. Let me actually come in here and try something real quick. Let me just instantiate that, because it may have something to do with the fact that I'm trying to dynamically hide and show that. It might be having some issues. don't know what that is, why there's another camera facing that way. Oh, I guess it's doing something, but okay. So then the other thing is I want to set this to top level so that it can freely move around. And let me see if I made any obvious mistakes there. Well, now it's just not lit at all. Okay. Oh, that's frustrating. Okay, one thing that would probably help is if I come in here and I disable the lighting. That would probably help for one. Ah, yeah, okay, it's still not working. That is very interesting. Normally this works. Let me see here. So let me make that local to scene. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that it's nested. Ah, yeah, that was the problem. It was nested. Okay, so that is not moving, which is interesting. Those cameras should be moving around, but you can at least see now what it's doing. So you can see that it's just rendering a solid black, which actually I guess maybe it is pulling in the world environment. Maybe I was wrong about that. I didn't think it did though. It's not moving though, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why that's the case. So if we come over here to player, let me just check that as current. Yeah, I'm not 100% certain why that's not working. Let me see. So the transform, yeah, position, rotation, and scale. Or you know what? I think we'll do global transform. That might be part of it. That's actually probably what was wrong. Oh, no, that actually made it worse. Oh, and actually, oh no. Yeah, that's curious. So now that's not working at all. So we do that, camera 3D. Where is that camera going is my question. Because I think the issue right now is that the camera is not going somewhere where it's supposed to be going. It's maybe looking in the wrong way or something like that. So let me log that. And then we'll log this thing. I'm just curious if they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah. Okay, they are moving together. Okay, so let me try just doing the global position instead and see if that fixes. I'm not sure that that's actually doing... Oh, that's interesting. I saw the tree for a second and then it disappeared. Okay, so there's something interesting going on there. That might be doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's actually kind of hard to tell. Okay. So now let's try the rotation. It could just be that that does not do what I thought. I mean, ultimately, this is also very much a hack, but I'm just exploring options at the moment. Just to make sure that this is even possible to do what I want in any way. Okay, interesting. So it's the rotation that screws it up. That's unexpected. I wonder why the rotation messes with it. Let me try printing that and see what the rotation of the camera is, because now that's got me curious if there's something weird going on with the rotation. Okay, yeah, it does change. The other thing is, let me make sure that this camera is even set. Oh, that's the other thing too, is that you need to set the FOV. So FOV equals main camera dot. And see, this can also cause problems because the FOV isn't a fixed FOV. When you hover over it, there's actually some complex logic there that deals with the aspect ratio. So if this sub viewport has a different aspect ratio, that's also going to mess with it. Because if you just try to apply the FOV, weird stuff is going to happen. Okay, let me comment out that. Yeah, okay, so you can see that looks a little bit different because of that. Ultimately, it sort of works. I have done this before. I did a prototype of a first-person shooter a long time ago that used a sub-viewport to render the gun because it predated Godot having options on the material to scale the depth buffer, so the gun would clip. So what I was doing was using a sub-viewport to render the gun so that it couldn't possibly clip. And I ran into a lot of issues with things like lighting because of that. I'm not 100% certain why at the moment that's not working. Clearly I'm doing something incorrect that I am not able to pay attention to at the moment. But in theory, you can do that, but it's messy. Like, already this shows that is a very messy, hacky way of doing it. But the benefit is you don't have to update visibility of anything. As long as you set the visibility layers of everything correctly, then whatever you want to be visible through that window, you put on a different layer than everything else, and you just set the camera to only render that. There are, I think, going to be gameplay limitations with that, though, because one of the mini games that I want to have is that the door would open. So kind of like this. So the door opens and there's a cutout, but it would be a shooting range. And the problem with using this plane here with a sub viewport is that those objects, if you aim at them through this plane, there's going to be a lot of potential for what you're aiming at on this plane to not align with the actual object in the scene. Now, in theory, if you set both cameras to have the identical settings and the plane you're using is got, you're dealing with the whole FOV aspect ratio thing, you could probably get it to work. And you would shoot through the plane, which wouldn't have a collision layer, to hit the target behind it. But with the stencil buffer, you don't need to do that because the object is really there. You're just looking at it through the main camera. So I do prefer that approach. Where I'm leaning at the moment is that what I probably need to do is a combination of techniques. I like the stencil buffer for choosing what to render that would normally be invisible. The trick is making everything else in the level disappear. Just hiding it isn't going to necessarily work unless I do something really elaborate, like add some sort of like area node that anything that crosses into it has its visibility disabled. But that's not a great idea, because then that's going to inevitably introduce bugs with anything that manages its own visibility, like an enemy that dies or something. So that's not a great option to do it that way. What I was hoping, and what I started with at the beginning of the testing, The reason why I was trying to figure out if the stencil buffer overwrote the depth buffer is I was curious if I could just put a big box the size of a tunnel segment behind the door that is flipped its normals so that everything faces inward, and basically make a skybox that just covers the area and hides anything outside of it. That's what I was curious to test, but unfortunately that doesn't look like that's going to really work. I can test it though, just for the sake, and see what would happen. So let's go ahead and just delete all that. We'll just leave the script there for now. So we'll get rid of this. Actually, I can just disable editable children. That'll reset that. Yep, okay. And then we'll just ditch that. It's funny, it's still got that loaded. Is that tree upside? No. Okay, so we'll disable that. Oh, that's... Huh. Well, that's weird. The, let me reload that tree. Interesting. Huh, I guess making that editable children did not completely reset it. That's a new one. I mean, I won't rule out that Godot also can get a little weird sometimes. When you mess with some of these settings, if you don't restart it, weird stuff can start to happen. Which I don't love, but it makes you feel like you're going crazy sometimes. Okay. So what I wanted to test is if I come in here and we do another mesh instance and we invert it, we do a box mesh and flip faces is on, and we just put this back here and we make that, you know, what, 2 wide, 4 wide, and we make it 6 long, and we make it, I don't know, 3 tall, and we just bring that back here because we have flip faces on. You can see into it now. So one thing that is true is that we know that there can't, well, I was gonna say, I know that there isn't gonna be anything in this tunnel segment behind it. So if I wanted to just hide the tunnel segment, I could do that. But it occurs to me that may not be true. One of the things I wanted to do gameplay wise is have a gadget that can shut a door that you've previously gone through temporarily. So giving you time to recover if you need it. Kind of functioning almost like a pipe bomb in Left 4 Dead, where the enemies get stuck somewhere else. So, but one of the things I wanted to do with that is I wanted it that if all the players are on this side of the door and you shut this door here and there was a player on this side, I wanted to make it so that the player on this side could override the door again, so redo the mini game to get back through it, versus waiting for the door, you know, because this obviously wouldn't be an unlimited thing. The door would eventually re-unlock. So I wanted the player to have the ability to re-unlock it, which means it is possible, if I go with that approach, there might be something behind here. Yeah, this is just where it gets really complicated, and where the sub viewport approach and the stencil buffer approach really shine, because they can't fall to that issue, at least not as easily. Although I suppose actually both of them do have another limitation. If you have a mini game like this where you can see through the door, if the players locked this door and then the ones in here started unlocking the next door and it was the same type of mini game where you could see through it, then both the stencil buffer and the camera would see the stuff back there still. Which I guess is where the skybox idea starts to, again, kind of make sense. My thought was that the skybox would load in, the tunnel goes invisible, and then you use the stencil buffer approach. That might still work. So basically this door would hide the next segment behind it, which is going to be difficult to test in this prototype where I don't have any code, but it would hide. The box is basically here just so that you can't see any other tunnels or anything like that that are going to be outside the map here. You know, that, but I guess, yeah, the problem is that players are still going to be visible. So if players are behind the door, then you'd still see them unless you make their shader. And enemies too. Yeah. So the stencil buffer approach, we get right back to the same problem of everything would need to have the stencil buffer to work, which is not a good idea, I don't think. This is a tricky one. I mean, there's a reason impossible geometry is problematic. There are simpler use cases for impossible geometry in the game that aren't going to have this issue. Well, no, actually, no, now that I say that, that's not true either. So one of the other things I wanted to do is there's a particular enemy, and I don't want to get into it because it's spoilers, but there's an enemy that is going to have a hole on it. It basically has like an infinite like tunnel. So it's meant to look like a vortex or something almost, but literally an infinite tunnel that's the size of the whole, you know, the size of the whole tunnel. But it would look like you're looking out into something else, like a void, which you could do with a shader. That's the other option. You could do a shader that just has, you know, parallax or something like that. But I really wanted something that looked a little nicer. Yeah, I think the key problem is the moment that you allow any game object to be behind this, with the stencil buffer, you have no choice but to force that to go through the stencil buffer. Unless there's a way to, maybe with a custom shader, this might be something I need to look into off stream. Maybe with a custom shader, it's possible with that pane of glass that's here to hide an object that's not using the stencil buffer. I get the impression that's not possible though. But it might be worth looking into that. So then the only option then that's more bulletproof is using a camera. So having a second camera with a different visibility layer, because then you can just set the visibility layer on the objects, which is not anywhere near as tedious as setting the nowhere near as tedious as setting the stencil buffer, and that would be a lot easier potentially. Yeah, the only problem is I've already seen that was acting up. I think that's something I'm gonna look into more. I think I need to do some more research into that approach, because that seems like that's probably more promising than the stencil buffer for this application. Or I may just need to make it so that you can't have players behind a door, or if you can, that the door can't be re-unlocked in a way that would let you see through it. I mean, this might be one of those cases where the game design just has to say that to make this effect possible, I have to limit something. So I could say that the door, I could tag certain mini games as ones that allow you to see through the door, and I could just say that if you're trying to unlock a door that has players behind it, you can't pick that mini game at random. Honestly, that's the easiest approach out of all of them. The only thing is that doesn't solve the enemy that's going to be going through the level, and might, well, actually, that might work. So the enemy I'm describing is supposed to take up the entire diameter of the tunnel, and it's going to have like a collision barrier in front of it so that players actually can't get behind it. Um, so theoretically, you probably could, as long as enemies can't be behind it either, you might be able to get away with using the stencil buffer. The only trick is, how do you hide the tunnel? Again, that becomes the issue. Because when I say the whole diameter of the tunnel, I don't mean it's literally wall to wall. This, yeah, huh. I think I need to do some more research, because I think the stencil buffer is the most elegant solution, but I need to see if there's a way to hide objects without relying on that. Because the only alternative I see is making a lot of concessions in the game design to limit stuff that would break the effect. And I do think the effect is pretty important to the overall direction of the game. I mean, obviously the effect really isn't affecting gameplay that much, but it is important to the lore of the game and just the direction I want to take. So I really do want to get this working. So I need to do some more research on that, because the only other alternative I can think of is to use the dummy camera, which I'll have to figure out why it's not updating correctly. Okay, well, I'm gonna take a break, but I think I'm done testing this for today. And I probably, like the art, I think this needs to be done off stream. I need to just do a lot of reading on this and figure out what other options I might have to make this work. What I want to start getting into next is some of the actual design. So everything right up to this point has either been practicing texturing or testing things that I've never really done before in Godot. I want to get into something I actually am more competent with, and that's the coding and the design. So for the second half of this stream, and probably for here on out, I'm going to go to my to-do list and just start going through some of the systems that I need to prototype and design, and we'll just start chewing through those, because I need to get those prototyped in pre-production, and figure out, I don't need to fully implement them, but I need to figure out how they're going to work. So we'll do that, but first I'm going to take a break and be back in a little bit. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to pull up the to-do list for the project. And I'll show this in just a moment. Actually, I should be able to now. There we go. Okay. So if I go over here to my projects, bring this up. So I have quite a few things that are tagged as architecture here, which are coding and design that I need to figure out for pre-production. So we've got the map flow, lobby architecture, settings system. Settings is probably going to be the easiest one, I think. Minigame system is probably going to be pretty hard. Interaction system, debug stats, loading and unloading, packet prioritization. That's going to be the hard one there. Okay, the flow is an interesting one. I think that's going to be a lot of reading documentation though. Settings is probably the quickest one that I could roll out. Okay, so let's go to settings then. Now what I'm going to do for this is I'm actually going to do a new project, and I'm going to do this for all of, for all of these architecture ones, just to make things simple. We'll just do new ones. So let me quickly set up a new project for that. I'll just want to make sure I do that off screen so I don't spoil anything about the other folders. So we'll put that in my prototypes folder. We'll do, I don't know, settings prototype. And we'll let it complain about. We'll let it complain about this not being a completely empty folder. Okay. So I'm not going to worry about resolution or anything like that too much, but I am just going to quickly just put something in there. Okay. And we will do a new node for the main scene. And we're going to add a folder called scenes, and we'll just save it in there. And that should be fairly straightforward. Now, the way I have done settings usually in the past is I have a JSON array or a JSON object that gets serialized to a file in the user folder. And then I just have a bunch of key values basically. I deserialize it into a dictionary, and I use it at just a bunch of key values to check what's in the dictionary and to write stuff to the dictionary, and then to re-serialize the file back to disk. That works okay, but there's some things I don't like about that system. One, there's no handle in it to detect when a setting has been changed. So things like camera FOV and music sliders, what I have to do is I have to just constantly update them every frame to check when the settings have changed, or I have to change it so that whenever settings are saved, period, everything that depends on a setting has to listen to the settings change signal and update from it. And to be fair, it's not like a lot of stuff listens to the settings menu. You know, it's basically like the player input controller for things like input bindings and sensitivity, the camera for FOV, usually some sort of audio manager for the audio bus volume levels, and you know, presumably some other thing for handling the display. And some of that you could argue could just go into the settings manager itself. But I'm not a huge fan of that. The other thing I don't like is that the way I've done this in the past is if I have a volume slider, the slider actually just goes from 0 to 1 as a floating point, and then in the settings manager there is honestly it's not even the settings manager, somewhere in the game there is a scale that says 0 volume means whatever decibels and 1 volume means however many decibels lurk between them. The problem is, if you ever change what that range is and all you were saving is the 0 to 1 value, you kind of mess over players whenever you do that, because now if you suddenly increase the max volume of the game, the range went from like +8 to +10 or 20. You know, that's absurd, but you're going to run into trouble if somebody had it saved at 1 before, or any number. It's going to change it. So I want the settings to actually serialize what your real setting is, which also makes it easier to debug if there's a problem. The other thing I've done is I have used just constants in the settings file. So let me kind of show here. So we'll do globals, or no, sorry, scripts. And then we will do folder globals, and we'll do settings manager. And now we'll create a new script. Let's call it settings manager. Okay, so what I would do is I would have variables like I would have a method called get setting, and it would take like key and return a variant. And then I would have a list of keys in here like master volume key, and then usually what I would do is I would have the ready method call like a load, and in this load method there would be the code to actually read the JSON, and then for every value in it I would have a line that's like JSON dot get that or some default value, and I would store that into here. And then usually there would be a dictionary of string to variant, and that's what it would do. Actually I should say this would do read JSON, so it would be settings equals read JSON or something like that. And then usually there would be some logic in here to set any setting that wasn't defined. It would set it with a default. And that's how I've handled settings every time now. For every jam game I've made, everything. And it does work. It's not a terrible system. But what I'm thinking I want to do is I want to move away from... So actually, let me say this. Here's the problems I have. One is that this class has to know the details of every setting, what its allowed range is, and that's not great. It has to have this defined list of keys. So if I want to add a new setting, I have to add it here. I have to come down into the load method. I have to add it there for setting the default value. And then I have to go to some other part of the code and I have to go reference that there, which isn't great. I don't love that. those are kind of the big issues I have. And then there's no setting specific detection for when the setting has changed. I either have to detect when the setting has been saved, which is annoying for things like the volume slider, because people usually want the volume slider to be handled in real time so that you can hear the difference. And I don't want to be constantly saving it every time you move it. Or I have to create a bunch of special signals to say that something was handled, or the UI itself has to be doing it. Again, I don't like any of that. I want a system where settings can be added as data. Settings manager not responsible for setting what would I want to say, loading defaults. Then I want the real setting value persisted to users file. And then I want signals per setting. Those are the key things here. Now, what I've been thinking about is embracing maybe using resources as handles to a setting almost. So what I'm kind of envisioning is that if we come in here and let's just make a new resource, and we'll call this a, I don't know, setting definition, or just, we'll just call it a setting, I guess. And let me just add that in so it doesn't complain at me. So if we come in here and we do export, we'll do setting name. So this would be what gets serialized. Then we have something like different types of settings. So maybe we'll have a func get value. So the idea would be that the resource itself, get value, maybe not. What I might want to do is actually have the setting get passed into the settings manager for that. This is one of the things I'm trying to debate. So there's two approaches I see. One is that the resource itself is your entry point to get the value. There's some reasons I like that, because that means that the logic for handling default values can be handled inside the resource. It can reach out internally to the settings manager, and it can say, you know, func get value. We'll just so if we code it to do something like var value variant equals settings manager dot get, and then you say pass in settings name, and then you can just say, you know, whatever default value is. And in fact, you could actually probably just do that. One of the benefits of doing it that way is that the resource now has the opportunity to compute a default value if I wanted to. So I could do things like try to detect the user's hardware, and for a graphics setting, compute the default value. So instead of having it be just a hard-coded number, I could do that. And this allows me that opportunity here. And the nice thing is that you can pass the resource around to different objects and just get the value that way. And then the other thing is, this resource can potentially emit a signal whenever it's been changed, or whenever it detects a change from the settings manager. So I can have the settings manager, for example, emit a signal anytime any setting has changed, and have the resource, well, Maybe, you know what, maybe not. That might not be possible to do. So resources can fire off signals when their value changes, but the one problem with that is that they have no ready function. They do have an init though, but I do recall there being some issues with that on auto loads. So that may not be the greatest option there. I might want to come up with a different way of handling that. Okay, well, the alternative though is that the settings manager has in its code a thing that takes in a setting object and it returns the variant. So you call the settings manager to get it. I think the biggest issue here, so adding them as data, the nice thing about doing this with the settings, so let's say we want to have different types of settings. So some of them are booleans, some of them are ranges. So I could subclass this. So this has setting. I could come in here and do, I could actually make this abstract, and I can do that. And I also need to do var there. Okay, so then I can come in here and I can create a new script, and we can say a Boolean setting. Actually, I should probably call that base. Well, I'll call it abstract setting, or base setting. It's fine. I can rename that to base setting. All right. So you can have a Boolean one here. And you can do things like export var default value, you know, false, true, whatever. And then you can also come in here and you can create a say range setting, and this may be a bit generic, but class name, I can do that, and then I can have export var min value float equals 0.0, or var max value float equals 1.0, or var default value. You know, so you can have settings that pertain to each type, and as long as you come in here and you have something on the base level for like validate, so if we take the approach of this thing is going to be your one way to get the value, you would have a method like func get value variant, and then this would have to be, actually I guess you would just do this. You'd have to implement it for each one, and then internally it would go to the settings manager and do whatever it needed to do to validate the you know, it would get, basically the settings manager would get the raw value from the settings file or null, and then each of these would have to be responsible for checking to make sure that it's correct. If it's null, returning the default value, or otherwise parsing it. You know, for instance, if the settings range changes, clamping the value from the file to the range. So that's a pretty easy way to go about it. I do like that approach. And the nice thing is what that allows you to do is I can come in here and I can do resources. I can create a new folder called settings, and I can actually create new resources. So I can have, since a Boolean setting, and I can say invert X setting. Actually, it occurs to me that's the wrong type. Oh, that's interesting. You can't change the type of resource. Oh, I did have that right. So I can have that as invert X. Oh, you know what? Hold on. That's not working because this isn't. Let me actually comment that out for a moment. Yeah, there we go. And you can have that as off, and then you can do the same thing. We can do invert Y, and you can do the same thing here. You can do that, and then you can have another one, for instance, like enable chat, and you can have that as on. And then any code that needs to reference a setting can just take in a preload reference to that, or you can pass it in as an export, and then they can use that to actually get the value of the setting. And that's kind of why I like the resource approach, because it does make the settings more data driven. Now, the interesting problem here, and similar, you know, I can do things like I can create a range setting, and I can call this, say, master volume setting. And for instance, I can come in here and I can say like -20 is the min value, the max value is like 8, and the default is like 0 or something. You know, values that make more sense for the volume. And if I have a special case where maybe I want it to be integers instead of floats, I can do that. Or maybe the volume slider needs special logic, I can do that. I've got a lot more flexibility this way to define them as data. So now the question is just, how do these resources interact with the overall settings manager? So the settings manager still needs to be responsible for saving and loading, and settings also need to be changeable. So these are something that you need to be able to edit. So the base setting itself also needs a way to set the value. And that's going to be an interesting one. So they need like a abstract set value. Now, this may be a case where maybe I don't actually want to use inheritance for this. I may actually just want to have each one have a set method of its own, rather than making this a base. In fact, actually, there's probably not much argument to be had for using for having get value be here either, because you're just going to have to convert it anyways, and it's, well, no, that might need to be there. Whether or not you need an interface here depends on whether or not the settings manager is going to be calling you to get the value whenever a setting is changed, or if you're going to call it. So for instance, in your set function, you can do like settings manager dot set setting, and you could say setting name value, you know. So basically all these act as are handles if you go that route. So the same thing would happen here. I'd get rid of the abstracts on these. So you would do get setting. And actually probably what you do is do that and do default value. Or, yeah, I guess this would need to be abstract so that each one can implement the method. But you would do something like that with the default value in each one. So now, setting the value needs to immediately trigger an update, because you could make the argument, well, okay, the UI is going to set the value. Why does it need to listen to it? And it's like, well, it's not the UI that needs to listen to it. It's, you know, the camera or whatever else may need to listen to it, that it's been changed. So whenever you set it, that's one approach. So this is the one design. So if we explore this, how would signals need to work? Because this is going to need a signal like changed like that. So how does this thing know when that's happened? That's always going to be the interesting one to figure out. One option is that the setting is actually self-registers itself with the settings manager. So it could be that the setting manager actually holds a reference to these base settings, and that the base setting itself is where the data is stored. So actually there would be in every object a value. And presumably this wouldn't exist in the base. It would be a specific type for each one, depending on whether or not whatever. But so you could do that, and then so then whenever you set a setting, what does that mean? So you'd be setting it, and you're not actually going to the settings manager then, you're just literally doing value equals value, and then you would do change.emit value I guess actually that is the other interesting thing too, is that resources do have a change signal by default, although that's really meant more for their stuff like the export. So you can change you can do that, and on its own that would work. I'm not in love with the idea of having resources store state though. Normally that can start to cause some problems. For instance, if you implement a state machine or a state for a state machine as a resource, and you copy that state or that resource between two different scenes, well, now suddenly those two objects have the same state, because whenever you copy stuff in Godot, by default it copies the reference to the resource. It doesn't make a new copy of it. You have to use the scene local option here to toggle that. So I don't like storing state in these things, because you can get all kinds of weird problems. Now with the settings, it's kind of a different story, because there in theory should only ever be one handle to a setting. The other option is that you can use a factory. So instead of and instead of the get value, set value, and value being part of the setting, the base setting itself just stores the parameters of the setting. And then you can basically have a method that returns a stateful object that will actually handle it. So you can basically cut all that out, and you can do get setting handle, and then you can have this thing called like a setting handle, blah blah blah, and then you have that, for instance. And and again, you can have like different types of these per type of setting you've got or whatever, but you can potentially do that. So you're basically treating this just as data. I don't really love that particular model for this either. I think that's going to be very cumbersome to write all of that. And I think if you're handing out handles, you should probably be getting them from the settings manager instead. So I'm not in love with that approach. Really, I want this thing to be the handle, the setting itself that you pass around. So I'm leaning more and more toward you just call settings manager with the object is what I'm thinking. The tricky part is getting signals to work. So either the settings manager needs a reference to every setting, and it will handle the signals itself. It will take over responsibility of triggering the signals, or the setting stores the value so it's able to do the signal, or I come up with a different way to emit a signal from it and translate it back to them. So let me look at my goals here. So added as data, that's covered by using the resources. Settings manager not responsible for loading the defaults, that's covered by that approach. Persisting the real value to the file, that's handled by having a get value. And then signals per setting, that's still where we're running into problems here. I think it's cross-cutting concerns maybe to have the signal on this object. So if we say that these things are just supposed to be data for configuring settings and referencing them, then they probably shouldn't have the signal on them, I'm thinking. And that signal should be coming from the settings manager itself. The question is, how do you detect, as a consumer of the settings, you have this reference to it, how do you know that a setting you care about has been changed? That's the question. So one option that comes to mind is the settings manager has a generic signal that is just signal setting changed key. Because again, you have to remember that the settings manager doesn't handle the defaults. But so it potentially fires that out, then consumers would have to listen for it and then compare the key with the setting they have, which I don't love. Or whenever you're saving and loading settings. Okay, so here's maybe a different option. Maybe it actually does return the setting. So it returns a base setting, a value is a variant. And then whenever you get setting, you don't pass it a key. you pass it the setting object itself. So you do setting, base setting, and then you have that, and then you come in here and you can just do and then in here you do like settings.get setting.key or something like that. And obviously, you know, handle default values. So you'd have to have something like setting.get default value, or something like that. So from a consumer standpoint, you would do in your ready settings manager dot settings change dot connect, and then you would just have to check, is the setting that got changed one you care about or not? So you're almost treating it like unhandled input, where you've got to inspect the object to see if it's something you cared about. Which isn't, I don't think that's the end of the world. There's not going to be that many things listening to the settings, so triggering an update on all of them and just having them check if they care about it isn't, you know, too bad, I would say. Yeah, so that's not the end of the world. You could also do something with like dynamic subscriptions, where you have a method to subscribe to the signal and it does the filtering for you, but I don't think I want to get into that. So this approach, you have to have a get default value in there. You'd also have to have some sort of validate method. So if the value from the setting is, say, out of range or the wrong type, the base setting has to have a validate. So I guess what you'd actually probably want is like a setting dot convert or something like that. Or a setting dot deserialize maybe might make more sense. So you're getting the key, and then you're getting the value, or, you know, whatever. You know, naming's the hardest part of this, so what exactly I call that, I don't know, but and then here you would literally just do getting the value, which you could also potentially do convert here. You could also, the alternative is you could do like a validation. So you could do like setting validate and have that return an error. So that way you could detect malformed settings and reset them, which is probably not a bad idea. The implication here is that convert would automatically handle it, because the reality is if you have a malformed setting, you're always going to just convert it to the default. That's always going to be what you do. But for this one where you're trying to set the setting, you're probably going to want to throw some kind of warning on that. Although I guess, yeah, that could probably still work. I guess you could call that sanitize maybe, or whatever else you want to call it. But that's not terrible. I still don't necessarily love the usability though of needing to check every setting. So one option is I could maybe make a special object that's maybe not even a resource whose sole job it is to check a setting for you. So I could have, for instance, and maybe that's what the setting handle is. But yeah, also, so abstract var or func convert value variant. I keep forgetting you don't need to do that. I'm not used to GDScript having abstract. It took so long to get it added, and I love it, but it's taken ages. I'd probably call that setting key, actually. So yeah, it just has convert as a method. Yeah, okay. So there is a problem with this approach. Whenever you initially load, you don't know what the settings objects are. So whenever you load, you need to trigger setting change signals, but you don't have a reference to the setting. So how do you do that? So you'd have to use the setting key. So this has to be the setting key, not the value. Okay. Because I don't want to have to register the setting. I'd prefer that if all of that's just handled automatically. I don't want to have an array somewhere of registered settings, because that's just going to be error prone. So what I'm thinking is that you could have a custom object that handles, well, okay, here's an interesting question. Can you override init on a setting and not break something? That's actually an interesting question, because I'm not sure how init works with globals. I think I've seen that cause problems before, but now I'm wondering if I come in here and I were to do settings manager dot setting changed dot connect, and I did that, and we do setting key string and value, and we just say if setting key equals setting key, you could do value change dot emit. You could do that, for example. So if I come up here into the globals, you probably can't see this, but just adding the settings manager class as an auto load. What I'm not sure about is the order of how this works. So is init going to get called before the settings manager auto load has even been handled? And is it going to get called before the settings manager has called its ready method? Those are the kinds of questions I have right now, because this has to be called before the ready method of settings manager, because the settings manager is going to load the settings whenever it's ready. And you want to make sure that everything has that, loaded and ready to go. So that is a good question. So if we come in here, okay, let me see. So I'm going to move this up to the top just to remind myself what the goals are. So we'll do a bit of testing here. So we'll ditch that. Load doesn't do anything. We're not going to worry about it. But what I will do is I'm going to call this method in load just to simulate this happening. I'm going to say setting changed. Yeah, this is also not right either, so that would need to be setting key, and we'll just say, I don't know, 1.0, or null probably is a little bit safer. And we'll just say invert X. You know, we'll just hard code this for the sake of testing right now. Okay, so that's going to behave like it would if it's just loading the settings. Now, ideally, this should probably be asynchronous anyways. So realistically, this would just trigger the asynchronous background load. Although arguably the settings are important enough that blocking the main thread isn't probably that bad. Okay, but either way, so we've got that. These are not going to work though, because that's an abstract class, so that's going to be mad, or abstract method. So let's come into here, and on the Boolean setting, we'll just quickly change this to actually implement that. And we'll just say if value is, I think you can inspect these actually. Yeah, okay, so type of value type bool, else we will just return the default value. Actually, we don't even need to do that. We can just do this. And this doesn't even need to be that, so we can just do if that elif actually that should probably be first, and we'll just do return value, and we'll keep this simple. So return value if it does not equal null, and I don't know if those are mutually exclusive, so for the moment, for the sake of it, we'll just do that. There we go. And you can assume there'd be some kind of logging in there, but we'll just keep that simple for the moment. Copy this, and we'll do something similar in the range setting. So we'll take that, so return value, we'll have this be a float, default value, whatever. You probably want some validation on this object to make sure that default value is actually within the min and max range. I'm not going to worry about that for this, but that is something that would need to be added. Equals type float. And then what you would do is you would do clamp f value, min value, max value. And in fact, actually, you can do that here. Just for sake of testing. Okay. So now that will attempt to detect that. And so I have my... Oh, all those are broken now. Invert Y, invert X, and okay. Now the other thing I wanted to potentially do is have mutually connected settings. So settings that can only be enabled if another setting is enabled. So I need to look into how I could do that, but I think this same model would work. It was just that this resource would maybe take a reference to another one as a prerequisite. So you would say that this other setting has to be true, and probably would just say that it would be a Boolean setting. So this Boolean setting must be checked or unchecked to make this setting enabled. So that's fairly straightforward, I think, to do that. I could also maybe look at adding another resource of like a setting group where the whole group gets enabled or disabled. And I could tie that to a to something. So I think I've got some flexibility there. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think this is a decent starting point that's better than what I've been doing. Okay, so now the question is, what's going to happen if I try to reference the setting? So let's get a reference to invert x. Wish it would add those as a... I really wish it would make these typed and add the or not, that's not a base setting, that's a Boolean setting. I wish it would type these and make them hidden by default. Okay, so now we're gonna put that in ready, and we're gonna do that dot value change dot connect on invert x changed. And we're going to take the value. And again, I could have different signals for different ones, but we'll just do this for the moment. Okay, so now let's see what happens when I try to run this. We'll select that as the current one. Okay, you can't see what it did, but it did launch. And yeah, somewhat predictably, it did not log anything. So, well, okay, that's, you know what, that's expected, because the auto load got called first before this thing ever ran, I think. That's why that didn't catch it. Yeah, so that makes sense. Okay, so I need something that actually updates that periodically then. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, this is really dumb, but I'm gonna come in here and I'm going to make a timer, or actually just set a timer. So get tree.create timer. We'll say like 1 second. And then we'll do .timeout.connect on timeout. And what this is going to do is I'm going to call set setting. Or actually, I'll just call this in there. I'll leave that in there as well for now. Okay, interestingly, it logged null, which is not what I was expecting to happen. It did get called, but it logged null. So if value... That's very curious. Why did that happen? Oh, right, because I'm not... Okay, yeah, that's kind of dumb. Okay. So whenever that gets called, that's the raw value coming out of this method. which isn't really what I want. So because this isn't going to have a reference to the settings class, my best bet is probably, and this is also making me rethink this get setting method. I do like that set setting requires you to pass the setting object in, because it makes it less likely that you can overwrite a setting. Because the issue is there's no real concept of ownership here. Two setting resources, you know, invert X and invert Y, could both be changing the same. No, excuse me, could both be changing the same key. I don't think I'm going to worry too much about that, but there isn't really an implicit ownership here. But I think what I need to do is in the base setting or in the Boolean setting, whenever this gets called, it actually needs to call convert on that value. So that's actually calling too few arguments to convert. What? Oh, that's shadowing a type. Did not realize I was doing that. Okay, let me come in here and fix that then. All right, is everything happy now? Well, that's not. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so it actually logged false that time. So now if I come in here and I change that to true and I run it again, okay, we see it did log true that time. Okay. I'm gonna be honest, this feels pretty hacky. I don't like that the responsibility is going back and forth between these things. So the settings manager is referencing this low level, or for one, there's kind of a cyclic dependency here, where settings manager has a reference to base setting and base setting has a reference to settings manager. Don't love that. And I don't love that settings manager takes the settings the way it does. What I'm inclined to do is actually go ahead and add the get setting and set setting methods to here, and then have settings manager only deal with the raw setting. So it would be like set raw setting, and it just takes the setting key and it doesn't call the convert method. And similarly, so we would just be taking the value. So effectively all the settings manager is then is just a dictionary. If I go down that path. So we have set setting, set raw setting. And we do something like settings dot set setting key value, whatever. Okay, so that no longer has any reference to that. And then in base setting, you would have to do something like func get value convert to value settings manager dot get raw setting setting key and same thing with set setting. So you would need to do set raw setting what did I do wrong there? Oh, right, no return value. And again, you could probably add additional methods. You could either add a new method to the Boolean range and whatever other ones to have like get Boolean or set Boolean or whatever. Or these methods could just be implemented directly on, these could be like internal. And then you could just add the public method on the other, which is probably realistically what I should be doing, because these should probably be abstract anyways. But okay, so that approach I think is kind of interesting. The basically this thing is now just responsible for converting the value and sanitizing it, is all it does. And it doesn't hold any state, or at least not any runtime state. It just holds configuration information. I do like this approach. I think this is a little bit cleaner, that there's not a reference to both things now. So one thing I kind of want to do, for one, move that out. So we'll move that actually into this main script here. So I'll have this thing pretend like it's a UI changing a setting. So we'll do that. And in here, we'll call settings manager dot set raw setting invert x null. So this is simulating there being bad data in the settings file. Okay, so yeah, return true. Let me check something out of curiosity. If I put the string null, see what that does. Okay, yeah, still worked. Okay, so that, and I can just use the same JSON serialization code that I already use inside the settings manager itself. I would just need to make that, saving the settings should probably be asynchronous, and I should probably emit a signal whenever saving has started, or honestly, I should probably emit a signal as soon as the save, as soon as the state is desynced, and basically in the UI treat that as saving started or something. But yeah, so I would basically want an additional signal for like settings saved, something like that. And again, that would be like a background thread that would update that. Honestly though, you'd probably want like a setting save started. There's two ways you could do this. You could either have a signal for started and finished, and use that to display, you know, like your thing in the UI, or to, you know, control whether or not you leave the settings menu. Or you could just say, as soon as in the UI you click the button, you treat that as the start and you wait for the finish signal. Really, I think it just depends on whether or not you would ever change the settings outside of the UI, whether or not you'd want that. So I think it's still, because that is a possibility, that's still warranted, and it's not a big deal to have both anyways. So yeah, that's pretty clean. Basically what it means though is that from a code perspective, you just never directly set the raw setting or get the raw setting. And in fact, if I really wanted to, I could also make these hidden, or, you know, private, protected, whatever. We don't have access control in GDScript, but I could do that to indicate that you're not supposed to be calling these things. And then it could just be base setting is the only thing that ever actually directly references them. Obviously, other than main, which is, you know, just for testing right now. So you can do that. The other thing I can do is I can do the invert X setting. I can do set value, and I can do this. Yeah, so that's still working. So that's pretty convenient that I can subscribe to that. The other thing I was thinking that this object can do is I like the idea that these settings can also potentially build out the UI maybe to a degree. So it's a real pain to, whenever I'm building the settings UI, to go in and say like, okay, we're going to do a new scene. We'll do, or not 2D scene, change that. Canvas layer. And, you know, add, you know, so we've got our settings menu here that's like a margin container. We'll do full rect on that. And then you've got your, I don't know, panel container. And then in here, you've got your scroll container. Or actually, probably what you've realistically got is a VBox container. At least the way I've normally done this is it's a VBox container. I might, you know, depending on how you want to organize your settings menu, but, you know, traditionally I'd have a label up here called like settings, and then I have a scroll container, and then inside that scroll container is another VBox container, and then inside here are all of my basically margin containers that would contain, for instance, a VBox again. And the only reason I'm using a margin container there is just to group them. It tends to be, it's like the div tag of Godot. I use it for a lot of things it probably shouldn't be used for, that I should just be writing custom controls for, but I don't want to write a custom control, so I don't. So in here I would have like another label, and this would say like invert mouse X, which is for some reason invisible. I think that's the scroll container is not. There we go. And I usually do always, so that's usually set to disabled, and then that is set to always show. Yep. And then I would add, you know, my slider. So, well, I guess this wasn't a great example to do invert. We'll do mouse X sensitivity. Oh great, I didn't misspell it. I don't think that would be embarrassing. And then, oh, that's not expanding. That's one of these is not expanding. Which one are you? Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. All right. And actually, yeah, usually there would also be a margin container in here, you know, with I don't know, 32, 32, 32, 32, you know, whatever. And then the point of all that, though, is that this thing I would have to add probably another label to show the value of the slider, because I don't really like the way Godot styles the sliders by default. And then I would have to add a I have to name this and make it a unique name. I'd have to do that for the label that displays it. Then I have to duplicate this and do it for, you know, I got to come in here, I got to rename it, and then I'd end up with a really massive script that is just linking all of these values to the settings object. And this is something I really want to avoid, because every one of these projects, this settings menu just becomes a cluster trying to maintain the like 12 different settings that I need. And that's for a relatively small game. That's not even getting into the graphics settings of an actual game, or things like text size and UI scale and all these other things that you need in a production game. So I want this to be built dynamically. I don't want to have to keep doing this manually. And And my thought is that in these settings objects, I'm going to have a thing to help build them dynamically. The only thing I'm a little bit skeptical on is we just talked about that this is now the thing that's responsible for getting and setting the value and validating the value, or sanitizing it. Is really what I should have called that, is sanitize value. But the problem is now we're talking about adding in the UI construction as well. I think there is a way around that, though. I think I can kind of separate some of this out. And the way I can do that is, again, with this, having this be data driven. So instead of this thing being responsible for constructing the UI components, there's a couple different ways I can see this working. One option is that these things just contain some metadata that says this is a slider, this is a whatever, you know, it just says what its type is, and there is a factory presumably somewhere in the settings menu that's going to read those settings and say, okay, this thing says it's a slider, so add it like that. Now, the one thing I am going to need at minimum is probably like a display name option. So either a display name or a i18n key for, you know, loading whatever the regional name of the setting is. So I can do that. That I don't think is unreasonable to have in there. So then in all these, you know, I can have in invert X or whatever, I can have another setting that's, you know, mouse X activity, and we can say that the min value is like, I don't know, 10, max 20. I can't remember what values I use for these are. But yeah, I can do that. I can grab that. I can put that in there. You know, and I can have it automatically construct that. The other thing I could do is I could have it detect the type of the setting. So I could say that this is a range setting, so construct a slider. This is a Boolean setting, construct a check mark. So I could do it that way. And I can basically make it so that you can edit all the settings in here, and then you hit apply or something. So there is that. The other option, so that option is straightforward because it means that this class or another class would have to act as the factory to actually construct all of these little cards. And you know, and the cards themselves may be scenes, so it's not like it has to, you know, manually add nodes or whatever. It could just be instantiating a range setting card or something. But if you have a small number of these setting types, like Boolean, range, whatever, and they're not too complicated, then I think that's fine. The other option, if I'm expecting there to be settings that need custom display, though, you know, for instance, some AAA games, when you go into the settings, instead of being a drop-down box or a slider or a checkbox, sometimes they'll have other stuff in the settings menu, like the gamma sensitivity, or they'll sometimes show like 2 pictures and they want you to pick which picture you want, because some settings are just not very obvious to players, so you have to do stuff to kind of explain to them what the setting is actually going to do. So things like that, if I wanted to do that, then you have to put the responsibility of constructing the display on the settings object. And I think the way you would probably do that is the settings object itself, I don't think should be responsible for that. Instead, I think you would have to have something like a settings control builder, basically, as a separate resource, and you attach that resource to the settings resource. So in here, you would take like a export var settings control, or like controller, like settings controller equals null, or you know, whatever. And then you have, that is actually a different resource which constructs the UI element. So then if you want everything to be a slider, you would just attach that or whatever. So I think that's a an interesting way to go about that. The good thing is, though, is that swapping between these two models isn't very hard. It would just mean going into the, you know, the previously created settings and updating them. Now, where the other thing to get at with the settings is settings order. So the order that they're displayed, whether or not they're grouped. There's things like that that start to matter. So for instance, in some games you might want your, and this let me actually bring up a site that's pretty useful. Game UI Database is a really helpful site. Let me find an example here real quick. So I want to find a settings screen. Okay, so let me show this. So these are different examples of settings menus, and this is a great resource for seeing how other games are doing things. So they it's just tons of screenshots that are annotated with what different menus and things look like. So this one, you can see you've got the tabs across the top, and you have the different types of control here. So you could have these types of controls, for example, could be constructed dynamically, but then you can see you also have this description over there. That's a very basic one. These are all drop downs, but you can see some of them are, this is where it gets interesting, because some of the settings, like this one, are arranged into columns. You can see there's some more types. That's cool. Yeah, so the tricky part here is that the settings are not always organized. Yeah, it's just kind of, you see how these two are in line. It's going to be interesting to try and express that as data is the problem. And I think at that point you're basically you're reinventing Godot's node system. So I'm inclined to not do that. My thought is that no matter what, this thing is going to need to reference all the settings. I think there are ways in Godot where you can basically at runtime check everything that's in a directory. So you could try to like dynamically read everything that's in the settings directory here and try and load it, but that would be tricky. I could create another resource which is like a settings group, and I could try to dynamically populate that group, and you know, you could add in some basic styling or whatever, or what do you call it, composition for where the settings go. But I'm thinking what I want to do instead is actually just make a node that's like a settings, what would I call this? Like a setting placeholder almost. So like a node that I add into the scene, and it will just you basically pass it the resource and it would add the appropriate control under itself. So that would allow me to place them wherever I want on the screen and group them under tabs manually without needing to go into these things and add in all that complexity. Now the one interesting thing would be when we start talking about setting visibility and whether or not settings are supposed to be locked or unlocked based on another value. That's kind of an interesting problem because some settings, for example, you can't change. They get hard locked to a different value based on another upstream setting. So that one could get interesting. I'm going to need some way to represent that certain settings depend on others, and some way to mark that a setting has been enabled or disabled in the UI. So that one's going to be interesting. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that other than just maybe adding a disabled option or an editable option that just like a signal that says like editability changed or something like that. And then there's basically the setting would check if one of its dependent settings has changed, which I guess actually this on settings change starts to work pretty well for that then. But I would detect if a setting that it depends on has changed and then update its editability to reflect that. There is another use case that kind of matters too, and that's if you haven't explicitly set a setting and if the default value should be different based on the value of another setting. So that's another thing that can potentially be done here. But yeah, I think this is the route I'm gonna go. Because I'm just thinking through it. I think the UI can be done a few different ways, but I don't think any of it is really gonna break how this works. What I am gonna do though is I want to kind of flesh the system out a little bit more and just make sure that the use case I want will actually work with the UI. And that this whole enabled disabled setting, I might be overlooking something, so I just want to test that I'm not. And if that's the case, then I think I can probably call the settings good enough for now. I think this architecture is, or this design I should say, is good enough. It at least addresses some of the main complaints that I've had in the past. But with that, I think I'm done for today. I think the plan for the next stream will be to pick up one of the other systems I need to work on and do the same thing with that. Like I said, I will probably not be streaming the art study for a while yet because I need to do some practice and learning on my end, and watching me struggle to draw shading or to shade something is not going to be very interesting. But yeah, thanks for hanging out, and that'll be it for today. See you next time.